Okay, so in this lab, we're going to take a look at t-tests. And specifically, we're going to have a look at t-tests where we only have one sample, but we're testing it against a population mean. So in all of these examples, we're going to imagine that our data here, which is on pirates, so we have sort of unique identifiers, sex, age, height, weight, is a sample of pirates. And we're going to try and use what we call null hypothesis testing to say essentially how likely is it that the results that we see in the sample are reflective of the population. Now I've already read the data in and loaded tidyverse here, so we're just going to go on to the first couple of examples. Now, null hypothesis testing, which is the way all the statistical tests that we use in this course work, is that we have two hypotheses, what we call our H0, or our null hypothesis, and our alternative hypothesis. And this is usually written as H1 or HA. Now, all of these tests are going to deliver what we call a p-value, so p for probability. And if that probability gets low enough, what we call reject the null hypothesis. So we say that H0, the null, is very unlikely to be true. When we reject that, then, what we're left with is the alternative hypothesis. And almost all null hypothesis testing works like this. So we specify our null usually as no change or no effect, and some kind of effect as the alternative hypothesis. Now, the difficulty is that this alternative hypothesis might be specified in a number of different ways. So we might be interested in, is something greater than a given value or less than a given value? Or in a general version of the test, we might just be interested in, is it not equal to whatever value we specify in our H0? And in a lot of tests, particularly the sort of more generally used ones, our null hypothesis would generally be that there is no effect or no relationship between our variables. In this example, though, these are single sample. So all we're going to be doing is comparing a distribution of the data to some fixed point. And in this first example, you can see that fixed point is the number of tattoos pirates have. And that we're going to say that our estimated value, we could say this is from a known population value or from a previous sample, is 10. So our H0 in this case is going to be that pirates have on average 10 tattoos, and our alternative hypothesis, our HA, is going to be that they don't have on average 10 tattoos. Now, if we look at the distribution of the data, we've got a ggplot here to do this. This is what our actual data looks like. So our blue line here is the actual observed mean, and our yellow line here is our expected number. So we can see that's 10. Now, in reality, that mean is slightly below, actually, our expected number of 10. But we've got to remember that this is a sample. So it's going to be somewhat variable in terms of its relationship to an underlying population. And this is what this kind of statistical testing does. It says, is this mean close enough to this expected number that we can conclude that, in fact, the true mean is likely enough to be 10, that there is no significant difference here. Conversely, we could say that we're saying, is this difference large enough that this sample doesn't conform to an expected population number of 10 on average? Now, in this script, we have some actual calculations just to illustrate what a t-test does to make this calculation. Now, we generally always decide at the beginning of a test what's our acceptable error level, and this is what we're going to compare to the p-value at the end of the test. So in this case, we're going to say that the error level is going to be 0.05, 5%. What we need to conduct this test then is just the mean, the standard deviation, and the n for the sample that we're going to get with this function length here. So the mean number of tattoos, which is our blue line here, the standard deviation, which is, of course, a measure of spread, and the length, which is going to be our 200 observations over here. So once we have these three, we can then calculate what's called the standard error. Now, the standard error is just the standard deviation divided by the square root of n. So standard, as in standard deviation, and taking into account the n, because in all these statistical tests, the number of observations tends to be pretty important. And generally speaking, more observations is going to give us more precision about whether this is a significant difference. So our standard error, 0.24 here. Once we have the standard error, we can then, as we say, standardize the value. Now, this is something we've done before. We've looked at turning numbers into their position on the standard normal distribution. Well, this works in a similar way, but with a distribution called t. So we take our standard error that we just calculated, the mean number of tattoos, so 9.46, and we subtract 10 from that to get the difference between the mean and the expected number. Now, this is what's called our t-statistic, and this is a general example of something we're going to see in all the tests that we use, which is a statistic. And our test statistic is then what we put into our probability distribution. So here we've got the distribution PT, so probability on the t distribution. So we saw p norm or p binomial. We've used those ones in previous labs. We also need here something called the degrees of freedom. And the degrees of freedom is related to the n. So the degrees of freedom in this case is n minus 1. So in a one sample t-test, our degrees of freedom is always n minus 1. Now, we're also interested in this case in both sides of the distribution, right? So we're interested in don't have an average 10 tattoos. So that could be lower, it could be higher. We know the actual value is lower, but nonetheless, it's a two-tailed test. So we're going to use PT multiplied by 2. And there, we can see, is our p-value. Our p-value is 0.026. And the final thing is we just need to compare those two values. So if our acceptable error level is 5%, this figure is lower than 5%. As we can see, this says true here. Then we conclude that this is a statistically significant difference. So even though we're only about half a tattoo off with the mean, we can conclude that this sample probably comes from a different population than we drew this population mean of 10 from as an expected number. In other words, we reject the null hypothesis and accept the alternative hypothesis, that these pirates do not, on average, have 10 tattoos. They're not drawn from the population where 10 is, in fact, the mean average. Now, if we want to visualize how we got this p-value, because these p-values are always derived from an area under some curve. And in this case, what we calculated was essentially this. So there is our t-value. You can see our t-value here was minus 2.23, and that put us in this region here. So the mean was lower, so it was going to be in this region, not likely to be up in this region. And this gave us this area under the curve, just about half of this red region, as our p-value, which is quite low, right? Most of the probability is over here. So this is what it looks like as a probability distribution from this distribution of the actual data. So something we've always got to bear in mind going forward, that we have the shape of our data here, which may or may not be normally distributed. Works better if it is. And our distribution of probability, which always takes these set shapes. And in this case, this is the shape of the t distribution. That's a variation on the normal distribution. Now, of course, what we really want to do is, rather than doing all of this manually, these calculations, we want to be able to do this as part of a single function. And that function is t.test. Now, all we have to do to specify t-test is specify our continuous data. So this is tattoos. It's numerical data, so it's just the number of tattoos. And in this case, because we're comparing it to a population mean, we need to specify that population mean. Now, in the next lab, we'll look at what happens if we are comparing the mean of two groups within a single variable. We call that an independent samples t-test. Here, though, we've just got one sample. So we're just dealing with the mean of tattoos, a specified population mean, which is 10. In this case, it's also a two-sided test. So two-sided, one side, two sides. And we also specify confidence level. So again, if you remember back to the lab last week, we calculated these confidence intervals. Well, the t-test function will also calculate that. Separate for the calculation for a p-value, which just mirrors what we do up here. But we can do the same calculations to get a confidence interval. So if I run this then, here's the test. And we're going to see the same numbers here that we calculated here. So here's our p-value, 0.26. Same as here. Degrees of freedom, 199. So 200 minus 1. Our t-statistic, identical to the one we manually calculated here. And we also get a confidence interval. Now, that confidence interval is for the mean. So our mean was 9.46. We calculated that here. And what the t-test is telling us is that with 95% confidence, the true population value of a mean of 9.46 is between 8.98 and 9.93. So even that upper confidence interval is just a little bit below 10, which is what we'd expect for this p-value, right? Because we're testing whether it's equal to 10, and even at the very upper end of its range with 95% confidence, we can see it's below 10. Now, that's the general form of a t-test with a known population mean. But at the same time, we might have situations where we have, rather than a two-tailed hypothesis, so two-tailed, i.e. we're testing whether there's a difference in either direction, we might have a directional hypothesis. Now, a situation like that would be the one that's described here. We call these one-tailed tests. So here, we're looking at the alcohol consumption of pirates. Now, in this example, we've got average consumption of grog per day. Now, this is denominated in units of alcohol. Now, most governments specify a maximum daily amount of alcohol, and here we've taken Italy's. So a maximum of 5 units a day. So in this example, we're not really interested in whether it's less than 5 units. Less than 5 units between 0 and 5, that's all fine. It can't go below 0. We can't have negative figures here. So all we really need is an H0 that grog consumption is less than 5, and an HA that it's more than 5. And we devote all our attention then to this upper end of the distribution. So again, we can visualize this situation here. So similarly, we have our recommended maximum here at 5 and an observed mean. Now again, that observed mean is slightly above 5, but we've got to take into account this is just a sample. There's some natural variation. In the population as a whole, we need to be pretty certain it's above 5. As this says, we don't want to falsely accuse the pirates of alcoholism, but also in the context of any public health intervention, we don't necessarily want to go through the costs and difficulties of, say, launching some kind of program to get alcohol consumption down if we don't have a real problem. So in this case, we want to be very sure not to reject our H0, that there is no problem here, grog consumption is less than 5, and accept our HA that it's more than 5. Now the calculations are almost exactly the same. So we take the mean, the standard deviation, and the length for grog. We calculate a standard error and a t-statistic in exactly the same way. The only difference is how we look at this. So in this case, we've got the same as the degrees of freedom calculation. We're using our t-statistic. In this case, it's 3.39. But we're interested in the upper end of the distribution, which makes it 1 minus PT. So there's our p-value. We can see, actually, yeah, it's really low. So we are rejecting our null hypothesis. So again, if we want to visualize that, here it is. So we have all of our error concentrated up here, or acceptable error. And we've got an even more extreme value than that. We have a tiny little amount of the distribution under the curve here. Corresponds to our very low p-value here. It's almost 0. Now, as a t-test then, there's only 2 things we need to change. So in addition to, we've got a new variable here and a new mean. So our mean of 5 for our recommended consumption. The data we're looking at is the variable grog. And we're interested in whether it's greater than that figure of 5. So this alternative that was set to 2-sided before, here we've just set to greater. Now, we're also interested in a lower error level here. Now, of course, we can just compare our p-value to this figure, but we might also want to align our confidence level with this. So in this case, we've changed the confidence level from 0.95 to 0.99. So if we run this, we can again see the same p-value, degrees of freedom, and t-statistic that we just calculated manually. We've got our mean here, so 5.33. That was the mean consumption that we saw in that plot earlier. The only other difference here you can see when we specify this to greater is that we're only getting one side of the confidence interval. So this, the test is saying, is the lowest plausible value with 99% confidence. That could be the population mean for a sample with this estimate. So the lowest it could be is still above 5, and we're not testing the other side, so we're getting a figure of infinity. Right? It's not likely to be infinity, but we're only interested in the likelihood of it being lower than a given figure. Now, of course, we could also just do this the other way around. So what, for example, if we were interested in the height of the pirates? Now, we know on average that height in the past was lower. So we're just interested in whether pilots are smaller. I'm going to set an error level of 5. So if we did want to formulate our hypotheses here formally, our H0 would be pirates are 105 centimeters tall or greater, and pirates are less than 171.5 centimeters tall. So this being the current population average in the UK today. Now again, if we visualize this, you might start getting a sense that these are basically pretty similar problems. So here again, we just have a mean observed height of the pirates in blue and our population mean today of this orange line here. So they're a bit lower. So one question we could answer here is, is this sample of pirates from modern adults in the UK? Is this close enough to say that actually there's no real difference between the mean of pirates in this sample and the mean height in the UK today? And again, all of our calculations for this are going to be exactly the same. So mean, a standard deviation, and an n. This is getting a little messy. We've got lots of these in here now. A standard error leading to a t statistic plugged into our PT. And as you can see, the only difference here is rather than 1 minus PT, it's just PT. So if I run these, T for height, you can see it looks pretty similar actually to our T for tattoos. Minus 1.31. Is that lower than our error level? Well, yes, it is. So there's our T statistic. Sorry, this is our test statistic. Here's our p-value for height, 0.01. Is it significant at the 0.5 level? Well, 0.01 is less than 0.05, so yes, it is. So we reject our null hypothesis that pirates are 171.5 or greater. In fact, the pirates are, on average, less than 171.5 centimeters tall. And again, just to quickly visualize this as a t-distribution, here it is. So for our test of greater, we remember that the area of interest was over here, as was our t-value. This time it's over here. So if we're testing whether our mean figure is less than a given amount, it's over here. If we're testing whether it's greater than a given amount, it's here. And if we're testing whether it's less than or greater, it's both here and here. And we split up our acceptable error across both sides of the distribution. And as a test, you can see this again. All we have to adjust is just a couple of parameters here. So our t-test this time, our x is height. Our mean is 171.5. And instead of greater here, we've just got less. And again, our specified error level here of 0.05. We want to align our confidence level with that. So if our acceptable error is 0.05, our confidence level should be 0.95. And again, we get the same t we just calculated, the same degrees of freedom, the p-value that we just saw there. And again, the confidence interval's the other way around. So this is telling us that the maximum height that we would expect pirates to be on average with 95% confidence is 171.1. So still less than our mean value for the UK's population today. And we actually have minus infinity here. We know that height can't drop below 0. But again, it's not a real calculation here. We're not saying that pirates can be infinitely small, just as we weren't saying they can drink an infinitely low amount of alcohol. And that's just our mean. So actually, on average, they were 169.7 high, but it could be as high as that. But this is still less than our 171.5. So that's single sample t-tests then. Really all we need to work out is whether we need to specify less or greater, or, as in the first example, two-sided. And just aligning our confidence level with whatever our acceptable amount of error is. And if that level of error expressed by the p-value, so our p-values here, is less than our acceptable error, we reject our null hypothesis, and our alternative hypothesis is supported. So in the next lab, I'm going to look at this with what we call an independent samples t-test, or comparing two parts of our sample to each other across groups. That'll be the usually most useful form of a t-test, because we often don't have any information about the population mean. But if we do have this, this is the kind of test that we would perform. So I will see you in the next lab, and we'll look at independent samples t-tests.